You know the image, right? A lone warrior, helmeted and armed, standing on the blood-soaked sand of the Colosseum. The Roman gladiator is one of the most iconic figures in all of history. We think of them as the ultimate fighters, as slaves battling for their freedom in this brutal, epic spectacle. But you know, that picture, which we mostly get from Hollywood, is just a tiny piece of a much, much more complicated and fascinating story.
So who were these people, really? Were they all just slaves? Were they heroes? Social outcasts? It's time to dive in, because the truth about where gladiators came from and how they actually lived is way more surprising than the myth we all know.
To get to that truth, we've got to peel back the layers of that myth first. This whole idea of just one type of gladiator, the slave forced into the arena, is just not accurate. The sand of the arena was filled with people from wildly different backgrounds, and every single one of them had a story.
Ancient sources tell us there were basically three main pipelines into the gladiatorial schools. You had prisoners captured in Rome's never-ending wars, you had criminals sentenced by the Roman courts, and then, and get this, you had free men who actually chose to sign up for this life. Let's break each one down.
Okay, first, let's talk about the people who had zero choice in the matter. For prisoners of war and for criminals, the arena wasn't some kind of career path. It was pretty much the final, brutal stop in a life that had gone terribly, terribly wrong.
This quote, wow, it just captures this moment of unbelievable defiance. So back in 100 BCE, a massive slave revolt in Sicily gets crushed. The survivors are brought to Rome to be entertainment. But instead of fighting animals for the crowd, they staged a mass suicide, refusing to be part of the show. And even the Roman writer telling the story had to admit the last guy died heroically.
And that really gets at the political purpose of these games. See, after Jerusalem fell in 70 CE, the historian Josephus tells us that thousands of Jewish captives were shipped off to arenas all over the empire. They were destroyed, either by the sword or by wild animals, as this terrifying public service announcement: this is what happens when you mess with Rome. But, not every criminal who ended up in the arena was facing an immediate death sentence. Roman law actually made this really key distinction. If you were condemned ad gladium, to the sword, that was it. You were dead within a year, no hope. But if you were condemned ad ludum, to the school, that was a lesser penalty. You still became a gladiator, but you had a chance, a slim one for sure, but a chance to survive for 3 years and get discharged, or even win your freedom after 5.
Of course, a system like this could be abused in the most horrific ways. The historian Suetonius tells this just chilling story about the Emperor Caligula. Apparently, the price of meat for the arena animals got too high, so he decided to feed them criminals instead. He didn't even bother looking at their charges. He just pointed at a line of prisoners and said, "Kill every man between that bald head and the other one over there." It's a stark reminder that for many, justice was random and life was incredibly cheap.
But what about the ones who actually chose this life? Okay, now we get to the most mind-bending group of all, the free men who volunteered. We're talking about people who were not slaves, they were not criminals, but they willingly signed on the dotted line, swearing a formal oath to be burned, to be imprisoned, or to be killed by the sword.
Which, of course, leads to the big question. Why on earth would anybody do that? Why would you trade your freedom for a life of insane discipline, public shame, and the constant threat of a very violent death? Well, it seems to boil down to three main reasons. First, and maybe this isn't a huge surprise, money. For someone who was desperately poor, the arena offered a potential payday. The writer Lucian tells a story about a guy who, seeing his friend was broke, volunteered for a fight with a prize of 10,000 drachmas. He actually won, gave the money to his friend, and said, "If I win, we shall go away together, but if I die, bury me." Sometimes, though, the motivation was seen as something even nobler than just money. There was a popular story told in Roman schools about a young man who volunteers to be a gladiator to save his rich friend who'd been kidnapped. The whole point of the story was to argue that this wasn't some shameful act of desperation. No, the speaker declares, he became a gladiator because of his virtue, a heroic sacrifice.
And finally, there was the glory, the roar of the crowd, the adoration, the celebrity status. For some guys, that chance to become a star of the arena was like a powerful drug. It was strong enough to make them completely overlook the massive risks and the legal disgrace that came with the job.
And that right there brings us to the absolute core paradox of being a gladiator. In Roman society, these guys were two completely contradictory things at the exact same time. They were the lowest of the low, and they were the biggest of superstars. So legally speaking,
Every gladiator was branded infames, which means the shamed or the disgraced. This put them in the exact same social category as actors, prostitutes, and pimps. They were stripped of most of their civil rights. They couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't even make a legal will. In the eyes of the law, they were completely degraded.
And yet, this is how they were remembered. These aren't just nameless slaves. These are basically celebrity portraits, stunning mosaics of famous gladiators found in the fancy baths of Caracalla in Rome. Legally, they were shamed, but artistically, they were made immortal. They were household names, the sports heroes of their day.
The Christian writer Tertullian just summed up this bizarre contradiction perfectly. He just couldn't get his head around the Roman hypocrisy. He asks, what perversity? They love whom they penalize, they bring into disrepute whom they applaud. It is a fantastic question that gets right to the very heart of the Roman mind. And believe me, the fame was real. The poet Martial wrote a whole poem that basically reads like a modern-day hype video for a fighter named Hermes. He calls him the favorite fighter of the age, a gold mine for ticket sellers, and get this, the darling and distress of gladiators' women. This wasn't just some guy who fights. This was an absolute rock star. But you know, you can't have a conversation about gladiators without talking about the one man whose name has just echoed through history. A man who embodied all these contradictions and pushed the entire Roman system to its breaking point. Spartacus. So it all kicks off in 73 BCE. Spartacus, a gladiator from Thrace, and about 70 other guys escaped their training school using kitchen knives. Think about that. Within a year, his army of slaves, deserters, and outcasts explodes to over 100,000 people. They marched up and down Italy, defeating Roman armies sent to stop them, but finally, they were cornered and destroyed in 71 BCE.
What's so amazing is how even his enemies wrote about him. The historian Plutarch, writing from a completely hostile Roman point of view, still had to admit that Spartacus was no simple brute. He calls him most intelligent and cultured, saying he was more like a Greek than a Thracian. He completely defied every Roman stereotype of what a slave rebel was supposed to be.
But the end of the rebellion was a brutal confirmation of Roman power. Spartacus himself died in the final battle. His body was never even found. And the 6,000 of his followers who were captured alive, they were crucified. Their crosses lined the Appian Way, the main road from Capua to Rome, for over 100 miles. It was a gruesome, unforgettable message to anyone else who even thought about resisting.
So, was the gladiator a hero or a slave? An idolized celebrity or a shamed outcast? The answer really is all of the above. They were a living, breathing paradox that embodied Rome's obsession with violence, its insane social rules, and its absolute terrifying power. They weren't just entertainers. They were a mirror held right up to Roman society itself.